Good morning, everybody. Who's our guest on the show today?
Our guest today is Dr. Destiny Knock. Good morning, Destiny.
Good morning.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Welcome to the show. What are we going to talk about today?
So today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about energy poverty. And in my group, we've been trying to understand how can we recognize who is experiencing energy poverty to make sure that we bring them into the energy transition discussion. In the United States, typically we think about energy poverty in terms of financial energy poverty, where if you spend a large percentage of your income meeting your energy needs, then you are considered energy poor. But this is really like the core part of energy poverty. And beyond the financial poverty, there's energy insecurity, like in Texas, when we're thinking about reliability issues, people who are at risk of their lights getting shut off because they can't pay their bills. And maybe they don't appear to be financially in poverty because they're not spending that much money, but it's because they just can't. And then the larger, circle of energy poverty is really about those supply concerns plus insecurity plus the financial poverty. And so then we are needing to understand, well, how are we going to recognize who cannot consume electricity? So if you need a picture for this one in your mind, in the pandemic, imagine, you're in your house in the winter, it's super cold. Maybe you don't have that much insulation in your house. So you're wearing your jackets, you're all bundled up, you're in sweatpants, and you have your space heaters going. And so even though you are not spending that much money on meeting your heating needs, maybe you are just not able to turn up your thermostat because you feel like you can't afford it. And so we actually have developed algorithms to identify when are people turning on their heating and cooling systems. In our test case of Arizona, we have found that if we are looking at when do people turn on their air conditioning units, if you look at the lowest income group and the highest income group, there's actually a 4.7 degree Fahrenheit to 7.5 degree Fahrenheit difference in outdoor temperature for when they actually turn on their air conditioning unit. So that's actually what we're saying is a hidden form of energy poverty.
Wow, that sounds so hard. Really great that you're developing the algorithms to study it. What are you hoping to do with that?
So one thing I'm hoping to do is to help broaden our idea of what does poverty look like? What are the compounding effects of poverty? Because we want people to be able to adapt to climate change, to be able to be comfortable in their home, and to be protected from extreme weather events. I have a neighbor, so this is my anecdotal evidence, right? My neighbor, she is 75, and she actually had to go to the hospital during the pandemic because it was too hot in her house. It was during a heat wave, and her air conditioning has broken, and she doesn't have enough money to fix that AC unit. So even though she may have been getting like a bill subsidy or a bill supplement, it's not enough to actually fix the air conditioning unit. So that's why I'm thinking we really need to think broader about, what do people need to adapt to climate change? What do they need to protect themselves from heat waves or deep freezes? And then how can we help make sure that people do not have to experience multiple forms of energy poverty?
What is the source of the data that you're describing us, to feed the algorithm? And is it individual household and device data, or are you coming at it from a bigger picture, or maybe both?
So we have household level data. We actually do not have device data. One of the big challenges with getting device data is one, the privacy issues, but two, low income renter populations typically are not the ones with smart meters that are measuring all the electricity from their devices, right? Landlords don't have a big incentive to make their renters' homes super energy efficient, super smart. So we have household level data from a utility company in Arizona, and we actually have found the daily total electricity consumption per day. So what we then do is we get the local average temperature in the area, and we plot that daily electricity consumption against the outdoor temperature. And what you're going to see is this huge parabola U-shaped curve, because the only thing that really changes in the home with temperature is your air conditioning and your heating usage. And so you're going to see these huge spikes. And one of the things that we've been noticing is that the low income groups curves are a lot flatter than the high income groups curves. So, that degree difference that I was talking to you about is just when they might even turn on their air conditioning unit, right? We haven't even gotten to, well, how much energy are they actually using once they turn it on? And there's a big difference there too. And we are speculating that that's because of the infrastructure differences. They just don't have the number of AC units as high income groups.
Wow. I grew up in Texas and I remember we had neighbors who never turned on the air conditioning before. I don't know if it was June 1st or June 15th, but it's pretty darn hot before that. And I remember, just knowing we weren't going to go play at their house. It was just, we were going to be so sweaty. But now, I mean, that was the 70s. So now there's so many more, 100+ degree days that it's not just being sweaty. It's like really a big health impact.
Heat stroke and heat related illness is climate change. It's an equity question. And then as we are thinking about energy transition and investing in a lot of new technologies, low income groups that are already limiting their energy consumption can experience a lot more poverty if they just feel like they can't afford it because they see their prices rising. We also have the same concerns with switching away from natural gas heating. The last people on the natural gas pipeline infrastructure are going to see their bills rise just because there's not a lot of consumers to help spread out those costs. And so now we also have to worry about the heating side too.
So does that mean we should electrify homes that otherwise wouldn't be able to sooner rather than keeping them on gas?
I believe so. But the problem is thinking about like, how do we actually incentivize that? When you're thinking about like a renter and a landlord, the question is now, how do you incentivize landlords to change the infrastructure in their rental properties, right? Because they're looking at it like they need to make a profit, right? So if they're really profit driven, they're not necessarily equity driven, or they're saying, well, it's just, I have one tenant or I have two tenants, or I don't have 10 tenants to spread out these costs. Then, how do we get them to switch over as well? How do we make it for low income groups to switch over? What are the dynamics there? I'm not going to claim to be a pricing expert. I can recognize who's hidden in energy poverty, but it's a very complex problem thinking about how do we get people to shift.
So definitely identifying energy poverty and recognizing the need for energy equity is a big part of your work. Do you also have good ideas for like, how do we fix it?
Right. So what I described to you is the work that we're kind of like takes a retroactive view. Now we do have proactive work where we're asking ourselves, well, what would be the most equitable energy transition? And what we have done is we've taken in these different decarbonization goals at the national level. So, you have like the 100% by 2035, low carbon by 2035, 100% renewable energy by 2050, low carbon by 2050. And there's all these trade-offs that you're going to get. So what we have done is we've taken this national energy planning model and we've been tying in these different decarbonization goals. And then what we've done is we've tied that to local impacts. So, who has the most air pollution emissions in 2050 by different income group, right? And we're seeing that the lowest income group always has the highest number of PM emissions in their area, always has the highest number of CO2 emissions in those areas. And so we need to, trying to think about how do we guide our conversation moving forward to get to the energy future that we want, and how are we going to understand those trade-offs? So one of the big things is if we just take the base case in our model, we see that the difference in the high income and low income group in terms of CO2 emissions, the low income group is always above 10 emissions per capita. But in the renewable energy by 2035, all the income groups are below 10 emissions per capita. So, that is one big takeaway, is that even though the low income group is always the worst off, in these low carbon and renewable energy decarbonization goals, everybody at least gets to a baseline of air quality, whereas in the base case, we're going to see wide disparities. One of the things that I'm really excited about with, where we are now as a country is one, the Biden administration is obviously very heavily invested in energy and environmental justice. So there is like a platform for that, which has never before happened in history, which is just super exciting. But then the other side of things is that a lot of people are talking about equity, right? And wanting to understand, like, what does it mean to be equitable? What does it mean to help somebody in poverty? And I think that, I hate to say, the pandemic helped people see stuff, right? It did. Sometimes it gets really worse before people actually recognize it. But even me being in my house during the winter, I realized I didn't have insulation in my walls, right? And I was just very cold all the time. Now, I have, been a poor grad student, and I had my lights get shut off because we couldn't afford the utility bill. And, that has really been what's made me invest in energy poverty. But when I first was having these discussions with people, they would ask me, well, why didn't people just save more money? And that's not what poverty is about, right? Maybe you're not making that much money to begin with, right? And then, oh, well, why are you going out to eat? I thought you were poor. Well, because I want to have friends, and social, like social hanging out is a big part of mental health, right? So now you're in poverty, you're stressed, you're financially poor, your friends all know you're financially poor, and you're trying to hang out with them, and it's expensive to go out. And so there are these compounding factors of poverty that you're always making these trade-offs, right? Like that's what anybody who budgets knows. Money is all about trade-offs. And so I think that now the conversations that I've been hearing at least are more of, well, what does poverty look like? And as we're moving forward, how do we make sure that people do not have to decide between paying their energy bill or paying their rent, or paying their rent and their energy bill, or paying for their food and the gas that they need to get to work? And that is where I think that the conversation needs to continue moving forward, because as I mentioned, like we have this national scale model that we've been working with, but national model it can't get down to that census tract, that household level. And so now we're going to have to think about, like, how do we combine multiple models and multiple research fields to think about energy equity at the local level, given these different national policies and how the landscape is changing.
That's so true and so important. And we couldn't be happier. I couldn't be happier that there's so much of a spotlight on energy equity, and not just a spotlight, but actual funding supposedly coming down the pike. And it's great. It's also like really big federal money, and it's hard to figure out how that money gets to the community level. So it's really great what you're doing, and that there's so many smart people like you working on this. I'm pretty hopeful, and it's a huge, huge challenge.
Huge challenge. That's job security, but also like it's great that there are so many researchers in this space. And I'm just really excited for the future, because we're in energy transition. The best time to make a system more equitable is when you're redesigning the system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really happy to meet you.
Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to meet you all too.
Bye.